Hear me and not hearing me when you're not supposed to hear me. It's pretty important. Okay, we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter number 19. Start turning there today. Always enjoy the opportunity to get to preach in the main service in the morning. You guys know one of my favorite books of the Bible is the book of Revelation, and getting to speak on what is covered there. The book of Revelation is a book of tremendous victory, right? We look and we find victory over the world. We find victory over death. We find victory over sin. We find victory over brokenness. And I love to rest in the victory that God has promised us. Today I want to talk about something a little bit different. Christianity is a faith of victory, but it also is a faith that knows how to deal with failure. Failure is something we don't like to talk about as much. We love to get up and hoorah and shout and celebrate when everything is going right. But when it comes to failure, we often tend to hide. Let's all step off to the side, step off to the side. Wait till this too passes, and we'll step up. We'll speak again. We'll bring attention to ourselves when we're in a bit of a better light. We have a culture that glorifies this, right? We look on social media, and what is social media, right? It's often a fantasy that we've all created about how victorious our life is all the time. All we do is we eat the best food possible, and we go on the best vacation possible, and all our kids always look perfect. I'm reminded of one couple I know, and they showed me this picture of their daughter, and she's holding these balloons, and she's just smiling, and she says, "Our daughter, right before we took this picture, one of the balloons popped, and she was terrified," all right? So she was like crying, she's crying, right? And that's often so much of what our life is, right? Everything is falling apart, but to the outside world, we look like we have it all together, right? Failure, as I said, is actually a tremendous part of Christianity. Our relationship with God began when we acknowledged our failure, right? That's what repentance is. We acknowledge, God, we have fallen short of your glory, and we recognize you're the one that can help us overcome that. You're the only one. Our continued positive relationship with God only exists through our humility, and often humility is recognition of failure. We fall short. We come short. We don't have the capabilities that we often want to have. So today I want to talk about how we address failure, but not only how we address failure, but how we use failure to glorify God. Some things that it's important for us to recognize when we deal with feelings of failure. Sometimes the reality is we feel like we're failing even when we're not failing. That's our personality sometimes. And so we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter number 19 and talk about a story of a prophet who just felt like he was failing. And it's an interesting story because for the past several chapters, he's doing everything right. He's doing everything together. And yet he suddenly comes into a moment of crisis and is ready to give up on everything, right? And I don't know if you've been there before, but I've been there before where you just run into what feels like a brick wall, and you're like, this is it, I'm done. It's not worth going on. It's too much effort. And let's see the way that God interacts with this prophet and how God interacts with us in these same situations. Starting off in verse number 1, and Ahab. Ahab is king of Israel at this time. He's a wicked king who has, if possible, an even more wicked wife named Jezebel. It says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Okay, what had Elijah done? Elijah has been a thorn in Ahab's side for a while. Here Ahab is just trying to go on and commit his idolatry and rule his kingdom the way that he wants. And here Elijah keeps coming and showing and says, look, God is displeased with what you're doing, and it's not going to rain for years until you turn your heart right unto God. And so Ahab hates Elijah and hates everything that he represents. Elijah, you probably have heard the famous story of Elijah going and challenging the prophets of Baal. And the prophets of Baal are cutting themselves and screaming unto the God of heaven. They're trying to call down fire from heaven to consume this offering, and yet no answer. And then Elijah has them bring out buckets of water during a drought to cover this offering in water, and then prays to God to light it up. And God throws down fire from heaven to demonstrate He is the true God. He is the only living God. Okay, so this is right after all of that has happened. Like I can't stress this enough. Elijah has literally just prayed down fire from heaven, right? I don't know if you've ever had a time in your life where like you prayed for something and God answered it, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing thing, right? Like I remember being young, and there was a light in the other room that I didn't feel like turning off. I was like, God, if you could just make this light go away, that would be wonderful. I'm trying to go to sleep. And then at that time, my uncle came into the room and turned off that light. And I'm like, there is a God in heaven. Oh my God, right? So like, if you've ever prayed and immediately had a prayer answered, you feel like, wow, this is the most amazing thing. Elijah has just prayed down fire from heaven, okay? And then we enter into this scene. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. And Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servants there. So this is the prophet that has just prayed down fire from heaven, and he gets an angry note from the queen that says, I'm going to kill you. And he says, I can't touch this. And he takes off and he runs for his life. First thing I want us to see, and it's probably nothing that's too surprising, but the first thing I just want us to acknowledge in all this, people are very inconsistent. We can be an inconsistent bunch. Here, Elijah, again, like he's just prayed down fire from heaven. What is Jezebel going to do, right? Is he so afraid that God can call down fire from heaven, but he can't take on this woman? Like, what's the issue here? But when crisis comes, if we're honest, we don't always deal with crisis very rationally, right? When crisis comes, the immediacy of crisis often brings out the weaknesses in our character, right? That conflict brings out what is underneath. And so when crisis comes, we often respond to it very emotionally. We don't always think it through. Often we go back and like, I know exactly what I should have done there. Why didn't I do this? If I just would have done this, everything would have been fine. But we just don't think that way in the moment. We're inconsistent. And maybe you agree with me on this. It's almost encouraging to see some of the greatest men of God were still inconsistent even in their faith. They still had moments of struggle. They still had moments of doubt. They still had times where, here these people are, they're performing miracles, and yet they still ran into challenges. I think of Moses and Moses going through, and they go through the 10 plagues, and he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he goes through the Red Sea, and he, prays over, and the waters crush the armies of Pharaoh, and he leads the rebellious children all through the wilderness, and he communes with God, and he receives the 10 commandments, and he sees the thunderings and the clouds of God. His face glows from being in the presence of God. He calls down miracle after miracle after miracle, and yet he still, one day, gets so frustrated that he disobeys the commandment of God and smites the rock twice, right? Even the greatest heroes of our faith, we find them dealing with weakness. For us, that can also often be frustrating. You've probably heard the saying before, never meet your heroes, right? And there's a time where we can lift people up on a pedestal so much that when we find them struggling with weakness, that it shakes our faith, right? We see them struggling and we're like, well, if they struggle and they have it together all the time, and now they're struggling with something, man, I don't stand a chance with this. And it can be discouraging. I want us to understand that people are inconsistent, but I also want us to understand this. While inconsistency may surprise and frustrate us, it doesn't surprise or frustrate God at all. We're going to see that God doesn't deal with Elijah here frustrated, or he doesn't say, Elijah, what are you doing? I just rained down fire. Go back there. No, he doesn't deal with him like that. One of my favorite passages in the Bible says, God knows that man is but dust, right? He recognizes our weakness, and he's prepared to deal with us in our weakness. Right? We don't have to be proud of our inconsistency. We don't delight in our inconsistency. But when inconsistency comes, when weakness happens, we don't have to throw up our hands and say, well, I guess God can't use me anymore. Find me a perfect person in the Bible that God did use. And you can't. Every hero of the faith that we deal with, we find them struggling with tremendous weakness, with moments of failure, right? We look at like King David and all that he did, and yet King David he was a murderer, like literally a person that we would send to jail forever, right? And he was still a faithful man of God. Like he struggled. We find these people struggling and struggling and struggling, and yet God is able to overcome their weakness. People are inconsistent, but God is not. People are inconsistent, but God is greater than our inconsistencies, than our weakness. And often what God does is He uses crisis to bring out our weakness, to make us aware of our weakness, because He wants us to grow beyond that. He wants us to become stronger in those things. So Elijah is having a moment of weakness, and Elijah might be surprised by it. The other people in the community might be surprised by it. Some people might even be mocking Elijah for it, but God isn't surprised by it. Instead, He's prepared to deal with Elijah in his weakness. God provides in our weakness. That's the next thing I want us to see in verses 4 through 8. It says, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die. Let me say that again. I don't feel like I gave that the right emphasis. He asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a caked bake on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came unto him a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. You're not ready to deal with this yet. You need some more provision. And he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb under the Mount of God. So we find Elijah comes to the point in his life where he says, look, I can't deal with this woman. I can't deal with my call. I can't deal with my ministry anymore. He goes and he finds a tree. He sits down and says, God, just kill me. Like, I'm done with this. I'm ready to die. And God doesn't come at him. And this is what I find amazing. God sends an angel, but He doesn't send an angel to give the man up speech, does He? He doesn't go and say, look, Elijah, you literally just prayed down fire from heaven, right? You took a sword and fought against the prophets of Baal. I've blessed you and I've given you miracle after miracle. You are being an idiot right now. Turn back around, go to Israel, go to tell them you represent the God of heaven, and you're not. No, He doesn't do that, right? He says what? This is going to take some time to deal with, and we're going to get you through it, and this is what you need to get through it right now. How amazing is that? God is so patient with Elijah right here. And it's the patience that Elijah needs. You know, God doesn't look at him and see this failure and says, well, I mean, Elijah's done. Elijah's ready to tap out, right? He's praying to die. How can I use someone like that? And he says, no. I know exactly what you need. And it's going to take some time to get there. Like, let's not underestimate the fact that even though it only happens in one verse, verse number 8 says, he took 40 days to walk to this place. Right? So Elijah's taking a little over a month to just grieve and to mope and to deal with his conflict, to deal with his sadness, to deal with his failure. And God says, it's fine. I'm the God of the universe. I have all the time in the world. Right? We are going to get you through this. So God doesn't send him a man up speech. Instead, He gives him what he needs to get through this. We understand, and this is important, when it comes to crisis, we have two different goals. We want the crisis to end, right? We come to the hardship and say, God, there's a hardship and I don't want to deal with this. Get this over as soon as it quickly can get over, as soon as it can possibly get over this. God, make this go away. God says, no. I have all the time in the world, right? Like, I created the world, I created time. Like, I can use as much of it as I want. We're not here to make the problem go away. We're here to heal you, right? We're here to build you up. We're here to deal with those underlying weaknesses. And I'm willing to take what it takes to get through. We want the crisis to end, but God's goal is to heal us, to transform us more into His sons and His daughters, to give us the character that He desires us to have, to be able to stand up to the next crisis that is going to come. And so Understand, I've said this several times, God has all the time in the world. God has all the resources in the world. Our goals are different. But I also want us to see this. God, because the resources of God is unlimited, the character of God is impeccable, don't be afraid to unload on God. Right? Like, God can take it. You read through the Psalms. I've talked to several people about this, and I don't know how to pray to God. Read through the Psalms, and you will find every manner of thing, right? Here we find Elijah praying, God, I want to die. You go into the Psalms, and you find David say, God, I want them to die, right? Like, you find everything in there. You find people saying, God, you find the most melodramatic, looks like it was written by a 14-year-old girl in their diary in their Psalms sometimes, right? God, I am the pelican of the desert right now, right? God, my tears fill up my bed at night. And you're just like, little melodramatic. No, like he's just laying out his heart, right? And we find that again and again. And however you want to go to God, understand God is big enough to deal with it, right? Like he can take all of your frustration with him. He can take all of your passion, your upsetness, your anger. He can take all of your disappointed expectations. He can take all of that, right? Like he can deal with it, and he provides healing in it. We see it time and time and time and time again. Again, how much worse do you get than a man who says, God, I'm just ready to die? Right? Not even, God, I'm facing death and I'm going to accept. No, just, God, I'm just ready to, I'm done. I'm done. And God says, no, we're going to get through this together. God provides for us in our weakness, and it's amazing. So we see people is inconsistent, but God is not. God provides for us in our weakness. Next, let's look at verses 9 and 10. It says, then there he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. They seek my life to take it away. So Elijah finally gets to Mount Horeb, the Mount of God, right? He comes to God's house where he's going to commune and talk with God. And he comes in and it's like God is sitting at his desk and he says, Elijah, what can I do for you? What has brought you into my office today? And Elijah says, well, I'd like to register a complaint. No one in Israel cares about you. They've thrown down your altars. They've destroyed your temples, right? Like they're not worshiping you. They come. Everyone has turned themselves to false prophets. They've killed your prophets by the sword, and I'm the only one left. I'm the only one who cares, and now they want to kill me too. What are we going to do about this, right? And so we're going to find out here that this wasn't exactly the case. Elijah wasn't the only one left. There was actually several thousand people that were still worshiping and following God. But in Elijah's mind, he was the only one. And that's what is important for us to pick up here. Suffering is very isolating. Suffering is very isolating. When we have feelings of failure and suffering, we often hide it from others, and then we feel like we're the only people dealing with it, right? And what can even be worse is like if we find other people that seem like they're dealing with something the same, we don't want to admit that we're dealing with it. We don't want to associate with them because then we have to say, well, yeah, I'm kind of failing, right? We find people all the time. It's like they don't want to go to the AA meeting, right? Because that's where all the other alcoholics are. And if I go there, that means I'm an alcoholic. And so I just don't want to deal with that. We isolate ourselves in suffering. We don't want other people to know that we're dealing with it. We don't want to admit that we're dealing with it. We just try to hide it and just hope eventually it's going to go away, right? In our private lives, and I've been here before. Maybe I'm just talking about me. But we can even get to the point where we start to blame other people, right? Look, the reason that they're not suffering like I'm suffering is just because they don't care like I care. They're not as committed as I am. They're not as faithful as I am. And that's kind of what Elijah's doing here, right? He goes in and he says, look, there's no one else in Israel that loves God. There's no one else in Israel that's worshiping him. I'm suffering because I'm the only one, darn it. I'm the only one who cares enough to stand up for God. No one else can do it. And so Elijah starts blaming other people and judging other people, not because of necessarily what they've done to him, but his own hurt in those situations. Suffering can be an extremely isolating thing. And I have to warn you, isolation and suffering is the most dangerous place that you can be in. It's the most dangerous place you can be in. If you allow yourself to be isolated, you're going to allow yourself to be at your most vulnerable, right? Again, look where Elijah wound up. Elijah allowed himself to get isolated in his suffering, and he got to the point where he said, I'm ready to die. I'm ready to be done with it. Satan wants us to be isolated. He wants us to say, look, no one else around you cares. No one else around you is struggling like you're struggling. No one else around you is dealing with what you're dealing with. You're the only person to have ever dealt with this, and God doesn't care about you. That's where he wants us to be. And if we allow ourselves to be there, we wind up in the most dangerous place we can possibly be in. I've worked in a funeral home for several years, and grateful for the time that I had there. It got me through college, help pay the bills. But it also opened my eyes to a lot of things. And it's my displeasure to say I've worked more than one funeral that happened too soon because someone took their own life, right? They dealt with suicide, and I've been at funerals where hopefully you guys will be patient with me on this. There's almost this idea, like, if somebody commits suicide, you just kind of think, like, man, that maybe that person didn't have anyone around them, that person didn't have anyone that cared or was supporting. But I've been at funerals where, there's loving family there, right? There's people that are supportive. I've been at funerals of suicide, and it's people that had well-paying jobs. It's people that, from the outside, it looks like everything's together. And you just kind of ask, like, what happened, right? Like, what went wrong? Like, what series of choices led to this? And it's difficult to find an answer to that, but the only answer that I found consistently is when people get to a point where they see no hope, where they finally get to the point where they says, look, this is the worst, it is never going to get better. It is only going to get worse from here. That's the point where people say, maybe it's not worth trying anymore. And when you are isolated, that is when you are most likely to get to that point. Do not isolate yourself in your suffering. And it's hard. It's hard. It requires a humility to say that I'm suffering. I can attest to this. I was raised in a family that we did not let other people know about our struggles. We did not let other people know about our suffering. This is not something that we did. And so it's hard to say, look, I'm suffering with sin. I'm suffering with doubt. I'm suffering with feelings of failure. I'm suffering with feelings of shortcoming. But the help that you need to get through that is not found in yourself. You have to let someone else know about that. And I encourage you, brother and sister, that's what this church is for. That's what brothers and sisters in Christ are for. Let someone know what you're struggling with. Isolation is suffering. Suffering is isolating, but it doesn't have to be. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we're going to continue on with our story here. Elijah has come before God, and God says, what seems to be the issue here? And Elijah unloads. And we see probably the second most famous story in Elijah's life. Verse number 11, it says, and he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke it into pieces, the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. The wind was, after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Came and talked to him again. So here Elijah goes out, and God puts on the whole light show, right? He breaks a mountain into pieces. He causes like a tempest. He causes this firestorm, this earthquake, and all of this. And yet Elijah knows God's presence isn't in this, right? What is he looking for? He's looking for something else. Instead, after all of this, God's voice comes to him in the quiet. I think Elijah was probably best equipped to deal with this. Elijah had experience with the flashy power of God, right? Again, this is the guy who just prayed down fire from heaven. This is not like anything new to Elijah. He's seen that before, and yet that still wasn't enough to get him through this, right? That still wasn't enough to equip him in this. Have you ever been at the stage in your life before where it's almost like, look, if God would just do a miracle, this would all be easier. This would all be better. I would all be, if God just wrote his name in the sky and it's like, okay, well now it's easy to have faith. And sometimes we think God, the problem is you're just not doing enough miraculous stuff. But what we find here and what we find all throughout the Old Testament is God does miracle after miracle, and yet people don't respond. There's a certain arrogance for us to say, look, we're just better than those people, right? They didn't respond to miracles, but we would, right? They didn't respond even though God was raining down fire from heaven and causing darkness and raining hail and parting the, we're just better than them, right? No, maybe the truth is God knows a little something more than we do in this. That even through all the flash and even through all the fire and even through all the big displays, the voice of God is more often found in the quiet, right? In the peace. We love the grandiose. We love the big. But it's in the mundane that the relationships are built, right? It's in the mundane that closeness is secured. I think of, my relationship with my wife. I think of relationships, think of your relationship with your spouse. Our wedding day was amazing. I don't have a problem saying, I'm a little biased. My wedding was the best wedding I've ever been to, right? I loved it. But our wedding day was amazing. I love it. I love the celebration of love that we have and all the family and all the friends and all the food and all the excitement and the events. But boy, that would get tiring if you did that every single day, wouldn't it? Right? We've gone on some amazing dates. We've had some, one time for an anniversary, we went to see the sunrise on the East Coast and the sunset on the West Coast. Florida's one of the few places you could do that. We got to see a sunrise and a sunset on a beach in one day. That was lovely. We wouldn't want to do it every day. That's a lot, right? We love the big and the grandiose things, but that's not where we live, right? Those are moments that we have when we celebrate them, but that's not where we live. The relationship is formed getting up and eating breakfast and going out and having lunch and sitting in traffic and just talking with one another, right? That's where the relationship grows so much deeper. With God, we love to see the miraculous things happen, but there has to be that consistent relationship day in and day out, day in, day out, right? Rise up in the morning, pray, read your Bible, go through your day, right? There has to be that relationship. That is where the strength comes from, is that consistency. Instead, we so often find people that during the mundane, we don't acknowledge God because we don't need God to get through the easy stuff, right? And then when the crisis comes, that's when we go into panic mode. That's when we go into prayer mode. That's when all of a sudden when we're reading whole books of the Bible, right? Just trying to get God to respond in those moments. We're so desperate in those times. But it's so hard to hear God in all of the chaos. If you want the presence of God, the voice of God to be in your life, you need to be looking for him in the quiet and in the mundane. So God reveals himself not only in the crisis, but he reveals himself in the mundane, in the quiet, where we ought to be looking for him. One last section here. Verse number 14. Elijah says, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even only I, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. This is the second time that he said the exact same thing. I can almost imagine him on the 40 days to Horeb saying, I'm going to march into God's office and this is exactly what I'm going to tell him, right? I have my complaint right here. And so he's going and he's got it rehearsed, right? He says, God, this is exactly what the problem is. And so verse 15 says, and the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be the king over Syria, and Jehu, the son over Nimshi, you shall anoint them to be kings over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death. And the one who escapes the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And you could go on and read through the rest of the passage here, how Elijah goes out and he finds Elisha, and he anoints Elisha, and he encourages him and sets him on a way. And we know the rest of the story, right? Elijah is faithful. Eventually, he's called up to the presence of God in a fiery chariot, right? A lot better than dying under a tree in the middle of a wilderness. But he's called up into the presence of God. Elisha goes on to do twice the miracles that Elijah ever performed, right? And so we know the story goes on and it has a happy ending. We just have this severe valley that we go through. But it's interesting, Elijah shows up and he lays out his complaint, and God is like, look, you've taken 40 days. I've given you what you need. We've talked about this. I understand that you're frustrated, but I have a plan. I always have a plan. I know what I'm doing. This is what you're going to go do. This is how it's all going to work out, and it's going to be fine. And Elijah walks away from that. What I find amazing, though, is Elijah's whole complaint is, God, I'm alone. There's no one else. And then God just kind of subtly hints, and by the way, Elijah, there's 7,000 other people that I have that are going through with this, right? And so it's like Elijah got there and it's like, 7,000. Oh, okay, I'll get right to it, God, right? He was met immediately with his need. We said before that suffering is isolating, but just to end with this, I want you to realize you're not alone in your struggle. You're not alone with dealing with feelings of failure. You might be struggling with a different failure or a different shortcoming than I'm struggling with, but we're all struggling with it. We're all dealing with it. We're all dealing with shortcomings. We're all dealing with feelings of, look, I don't know how to handle this situation. I don't know how to be the best spouse that I need to be, the best parent that I need to be, the best friend that I need to be. I don't know if I'm handling my money the right way. I don't know if I'm doing my job. We all deal with those struggles, right? We all deal with that. We all deal with the shortcomings of, look, I have loved ones that need the gospel, and I don't know what to say to them. We deal with it. It's something that is a part of who we are. We're not alone in the struggle. Not only are we not alone because God is present with us, but look around the room. We're not alone because we have, the 7,000 here with us. We have our brothers and sisters in Christ here to support us and here to go with us. The necessity, though, is to be open about it. If every one of us hides it, if every one of us hides the insecurity, if every one of us hides the struggle, then we won't be open to meet the needs. We won't be open to help and to serve others. We won't be open to say, oh, that's the struggle. I've been there. I know how to help with that. I know how to provide healing in those situations. God has enabled me to deal with this. It's one of the most amazing things. You go and you look at the first church. I feel like some pastors want to avoid it because it sounds too socialist, but you go and you read, and we find people in the first church, and we find poor people, and it says, look, I just don't have enough to pay my bills. And then we find other people going and selling their property, right, so that they could be able to pay for it, so that no one, it says in the first church, no one had any needs that weren't being met. All of their lack was provided for. Why? They were open about it. And the people who had the capability to do something about it were able to step up and do something about it, right? We have to have that openness in order. We must be open and we must serve in order that the needs of others are met. Guys, again, I think we live in a culture where the response to people struggling with failure is just to say, look, man up and deal with it, right? You can get over this. You're better than that. But if we look in this passage, we see the consequences that can come from not handling with these feelings appropriately. I can't stress enough. Elijah was at the point where he wanted to die, right? That's the biggest consequence. You can't get much more permanent than that. He was at the point where he wanted to die. We have people that are just willing to give up. Maybe they're not at the point of at death. They're at the point where they're willing to take their own life. We have people that say, look, if it's not getting any better, look, I can't keep serving in this ministry. I can't keep teaching this class. I can't keep doing these things. I can't keep helping others or reaching out to others. I can't keep giving like I'm giving. We have people that are at the point where they're saying, look, I'm ready to give up. And we have to have that mutual support. Let them know that they are not alone. So we wrap up. I encourage you guys, don't accept the lie that you're the only one that are dealing with these things. Pursue God, right? Pursue not his works, but his presence, right? Don't pursue the miracles of God, but pursue the presence of God in your life. Pursue the people in your life that God has put to help and to support you. Be humble enough to say, look, I am struggling. I am dealing with an issue. Be humble enough to accept help when it is offered. If you have the ability to help, as we read, when it's your power to do good unto your neighbor, do it. And it's amazing what God will accomplish through those simple acts, right? We close with this, like, started the beginning of all this saying, like, Christianity is a faith of victory, but the beginning of the relationship with God is acknowledging our own failure, is acknowledging our own shortcoming. And everything that we talked about, being supportive, meeting a need, just because you have the capability of meeting a need, is one of the most godly things that we possibly see. God saw humanity fallen in their sinfulness, and he could have said, not my problem, right? I don't have to deal with this. I'm the God of the universe. I can let all of you go to hell. I could just make another humanity, right? Like, he has the capability to do all of that. But he showed his love towards us, and that while we were his enemies, Christ died for us, right? When we had no value to offer him at all, he was still willing to say, yeah, I'll help you. I'll come down to where you are, and I'll meet your needs. Quite literally, I'll come down to where you are. I will walk in the weakness that you walk in. I will struggle with the things that you struggle with on this physical world. I will suffer and be put to death on your behalf. I, who know no sin, will bear sin for you so that you might have my righteousness, right? That's the testimony of the gospel. If you don't believe that, if you haven't accepted that, if you haven't received that, now's the invitation. Now's the time. If you have received that, though, my encouragement, live that out in your own life by finding those who are dealing with that struggling and helping in that situation. God, we come before you so grateful for the story of Elijah. God, I am sure that when he was dealing with this, he was not grateful at all. He was not delighted to be struggling with these things. But eventually, he came to a point of delight. He saw the work that you were accomplishing. He saw the men and women that you were raising up to serve on your behalf. He entered into glory in your presence. And as your word said, you work all things together for good in the end. God, we might have brothers and sisters today who are dealing with feelings of failure, feelings of shortcoming. And again, they're not grateful in that. They're not delighting in that. But the message has been spoken that you provide help, you provide sustenance in that. You don't always just make the problem go away, but you provide the people, you provide the grace to get through the problem, to endure, or to enter into your glory as you've prepared for us. God, I pray that people would just recognize what you've laid out, what you've prepared for them today. God, for those who have the ability to help, who have the ability to ease a suffering, who have the ability to help a brother dealing with weakness overcome their weakness, a sister dealing with feelings of failure, to overcome, to find the victory that we're promised in you. God, I pray that we would have the courage and the commitment to step up and do it. We pray all this in the name of Christ. Amen. Always appreciate the opportunity to speak, appreciate having everyone here today. I believe Pastor will be back tonight. So we'll be back. Are you guys doing the personality series on Sunday nights or Wednesday nights? Sunday nights. So we'll be continuing our personality series here tonight. We'll have youth group as normal back in the back. So looking forward to all that. Things returning to normal, but grateful for the people. Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy had like the little one-man show up here today and killed it, right? So grateful for the people stepping up to help in those things. But we're going to close in a word of prayer. I'm going to ask Jamie, would you mind closing us